nobody in their right mind would substitute on a purely financial basis. You wouldn't substitute nuclear energy with wind energy. So the transfer from the one to the other is a public policy objective. Therefore, the whole scheme is directed by the government, and the money needed to repay the debt gets lumped onto everybody's energy bills. And in that sense, it's a form of shadow taxation. China is so important to Labour's growth plans. Yes, it is. They'll be a major provider of the financing. And the other area is what's known as shadow banks. In other words, names like BlackRock or Apollo, these hedge funds, private equity. And I worked out the total cost of repaying the debt and paying the interest based on that template, and the answer came out to £6.7 trillion, which is 230% of the size of the UK economy.
Hello and welcome to the MoneyMagpie Invest podcast. I'm Jasmine Birtles, founder of MoneyMagpie.com. Don't forget to follow us, subscribe, comment, like, comment again, because I always have a look at the comments that you make and I do like to reply. So remember to comment, tell your friends. And also remember that nothing that's said in these podcasts should be taken as financial advice. It's information only. And today I'm really pleased to have my friend Bob Lyddon here. Bob is a banking consultant and he's compiled a paper for the Institute for Research into Economic and Fiscal Issues. I think I've got it right there, haven't I, Bob? Is
Yes,
that right?
yes.
It's quite a mouthful, that one.
It is.
Yes, and so this report that you've done, Bob, is looking at the way the government is funding its investment projects. And to be frank, I think that the findings that you've come up with are quite staggering. I mean, what's the top line here from your report, your research?
Yes, firstly, the government, they intend to be re-elected. So they're talking about a decade of national renewal. This is their phrase, from till 2035. Their plans involve them spending £1.6 trillion. Partially, about 40% of it's on net zero, but the remainder is their industrial strategy and their infrastructure strategy. That 1.64 trillion, which is 58% of the size of the UK economy, is what will be spent. But the way they're intending to do it only contains a certain proportion of government funding. So what they're proposing is to borrow. I mean, the whole lot will be borrowed. The whole 1.64 trillion will be borrowed, but only 270 billion will be borrowed by the government itself. The rest, the projects will borrow. So these projects will borrow under what's known as a leverage financing template, well known from the global financial crisis, and which is extremely expensive. But
So
it's
when you say
1.64.
When you say that these individual projects will borrow, who will they borrow from? Will it be from us, the taxpayers, or will it?
Well, if you're a pensioner, I think they want to make sure that certain types of pension scheme put their money into these enterprises. That's why you had something called the Mansion House Accord, where certain types of pension plan agreed that they'd put £50 billion into these projects. Of course, that's nothing like enough. But the other main sources will be China. You know, when we can't investigate these people who gave secrets to the Chinese, the explanation was because China is so important to Labour's growth plans. Yes, it is. They'll be a major provider of the financing. And the other area is what's known as shadow banks. In other words, names like BlackRock or Apollo, these hedge funds, private equity, I mean, these are the ones about whom Andrew Bailey at the Bank of England recently expressed doubts as to their viability. But those are the types of institution that the money's going to come from. And of course, they don't lend for free. Their target returns are very high. And the delusion we're seen to be labouring under, or literally Labour are labouring under, is that you can borrow all this money from these sources and it isn't going to cost an arm and a leg to pay back. So the other part of my research was I put together an example funding template for a project of this type. And then I worked out the total cost of repaying the debt and paying the interest based on that template. And the answer came out to £6.7 trillion, which is 230% of the size of the UK economy. You know, you're talking about 7 or 8% of GDP per annum just going on this. And the major trick, the trickery, is that the government itself will firstly only borrow a modest portion of that itself, probably a seventh, under the heading of borrowing for investment. That's what it's called. And then in the government's new measure of national debt, which they have adopted, which is called public sector net liabilities, because the 270 billion will be spent on something, they can say, oh, that's an asset. So the asset offsets the debt and public sector net liabilities doesn't rise. So you've got their main measure of debt in which neither the amount they borrow themselves nor the amount that the projects borrow from China, shadow banks, whoever, none of that affects the statistic of the national debt. And yet, one way or another, UK business as individuals are collectively responsible for it, just like they're responsible for the debt that is acknowledged.
I was thinking our tax payments and our pension funds, much of that is going into paying for these debts that we don't even know are there.
Well, they're not there yet. They're starting to be there. You know, when the government says we're going to invest X billion on carbon capture, that money's borrowed or will be borrowed. But the trick is that just as only a small portion of the money is actually borrowed by the government, so the repayments through taxes, visible taxes, are quite low. But when the money goes into a onshore wind power scheme, the repayment of the debt is through increased electricity charges. So the increased electricity charge, because nobody in their right mind would substitute on a purely financial basis, you wouldn't substitute nuclear energy with wind energy. So the transfer from the one to the other is a public policy objective. Therefore, the whole scheme is directed by the government, and the money needed to repay the debt gets lumped onto everybody's energy bills. And in that sense, it's a form of shadow taxation. So the money borrowed is a shadow debt, and the money to repay it is shadow taxation, because it's an extra burden on us collectively that would not otherwise have been there.
So we already have the most expensive energy in the G7 and probably in the West generally. So are you saying that with these projects, these new projects, I mean, you were saying that 40% of these investment projects are supposed to be for climate change and stuff like that. So it's going to get even worse because of these net zero projects that they want to bring in.
Well, yes, it is. But the other trick that they can pull is that the supplier gets a subsidy from the taxpayer. So then the energy doesn't look as if it's quite as expensive, but we pay through our taxes. So one way or another, we pay. And we can end up paying to subsidize something we buy ourselves. I mean, how ludicrous is that? It's just a circle of money where we pay taxes in, it goes to an energy supplier, and they offset the cost of production so that our energy bill looks lower. But actually, we've paid for the subsidy. It's all coming from us, albeit, of course, that those on higher marginal tax rates will end up subsidizing those on lower tax rates. So there's a wealth transfer element in this, which is from the better off to the less well off. So there's a political plus for Labour in getting the south of England to subsidise everywhere else as usual. But yes, the thing is, this is meaningful extra burdens that UK businesses and individuals will have to shoulder collectively, in addition to higher visible taxes and the rising visible national debt. Because the national debt that's acknowledged isn't going down, it's going up. So you've got taxes going up, the debt going up, and you've got this on top. It's actually a catastrophe, complete catastrophe.
But a lot of people, those particularly who have voted for Labour and maybe Liberal Democrat, would say, well, it's fair enough to have a transfer of wealth from the wealthy to the not so well off, and from the wealthy south to the very much poorer north. Wouldn't you say that's a decent thing to do?
Well, it's not going to be, the north isn't going to be poorer very much longer. You're going to have just the whole thing turned on its head. It's just one of the things. So where you have potentially a so-called mansion tax, that will be a device to take money from the south to go to the north. Also, these investment plans are heavily concentrated where the money will be spent. Heavily concentrated. Tyneside, Teesside, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Bradford, Sheffield, Doncaster. No, actually not so much Doncaster. All the places with Labour mayors like Andy Burnham. So what you'd say is called pork barrel politics. That's an American phrase for the politician brings about large expenditures into their electoral district in order to get re-elected. So looked at through a different prism, this is an absolutely enormous pork barrel politics exercise for Labour to pour money into the, in a way it's like the Industrial Revolution heartlands, and take it away from everywhere else. Plus loads goes to these shadow banks and China. It's comical, really.
But it looks very much like Labour's not going to get in at the next election and may not even get to the next election. I mean, that's supposed to be 2029, the way things are going at the moment. You wonder if they're going to survive 2026, to be honest. So
Well, I
it's
think they
quite
are. No, I think they'll make the full term. If you look back at the history of the Labour Party, they're very good at keeping themselves in power once they've got it, because they know this is the last chance. And why is Ed Miliband accelerating net zero to 2030? Because it's doubtful whether he'll get back in again. So just as these politicians can create shadow debts, they're made by contracts. They're really created by contracts, whereby a 20-year contract with an energy supplier locks in that cost for us for 20 years from the time the project takes off. So what he's going to do is sign all those contracts before in the next 5 years. So, and there was some wording in one of the Labour documents about giving certainty to investors. Yes, absolutely. They will sign irrevocable contracts before 2030 for most of this, so that basically, I don't know what we can do, really. Nevertheless, most of this will be committed by 2030, and then it'll take a very brave new government to try to unravel it.
But we do know that really now the majority of the electorate is against net zeros, against the whole climate change ideology. So do you feel that there could be a groundswell of dissent against the spending on net zero projects, particularly when it becomes clearer and clearer that these are increasing our energy costs, which is bad for us as individuals and particularly bad for business and innovation?
Hi, I'm going to quickly interrupt this amazing podcast to let you know that Money Magpie Invest has a bi-weekly newsletter where we share tips, tricks and insights to help you become a more confident investor. Our newsletter is completely free to sign up to, and it will arrive in your inbox on Saturdays at 12:30 p.m. As well as all of the super useful investing information, we also share exclusive deals from our partners. So if you're serious about building long-term wealth for yourself, I really recommend signing up. And you can find the link in the description of this podcast.
Well, I agree with all of that, but I think, Labour were only elected 16 months ago with a great chunk of their manifesto, which is the Green Prosperity Plan. And, under our electoral system, they could turn around and say, well, we got a huge majority based on that. So what's the problem? And it'll be another election in 3.5 years. The issue is how much damage they can do by then, and to lock in the damage through to the 2050s or even the 2060s. So the damage will be ongoing for a period of 30 years from now, just like Labour's previous administration locked in a very high cost of the Private Finance Initiative, PFI, under which mainly it was schools, hospitals, university buildings. Those have cost an arm and a leg and will still continue to cost through to 2052. So 42 years after New Labour left power, the country will still be paying for the contracts they entered into while in power. And that's the template. That's what they're going to do again.
So what would you do, Bob, instead? Because I can understand from their point of view, they feel that these projects need to be done. You need hospitals, you need universities, you need schools, and now, they're saying we need wind turbines, we need, all sorts of other stuff, and we don't have the money, therefore we're going to have to go to the market and borrow the money. What do you think they should do instead?
Well, it's really difficult because the one thing they should do is cut current expenditure, but they won't. So the day-to-day costs of government are completely out of control. So they could create headroom for spending on net zero by cutting current day-to-day expenditure, but that appears to be unacceptable. The other thing they could do is only spend what the government borrows. So if they borrowed 270 billion, we'll spend 270 billion. Don't use it within this template where, this amount is put in by the government at the bottom as the high risk piece, and then they borrow 4 or 5 times that on top in the scheme, in the leveraged financing. So they shouldn't be doing that. The industry and infrastructure strategies are basically ways of pork barreling loads of money into Labour areas. That should go. It's absolutely worthless. The idea that that's going to bring anything is a pipe dream. So that if they think net zero is important, concentrate on that. Nuclear, let's have a bigger role for nuclear. And they have to continue to exploit the North Sea. So it's ludicrous that we should be buying oil and gas from Norway that's extracted from the North Sea when we get it much cheaper ourselves. We're still using it. We're still burning it here, creating the CO2. But to not use our own reserves while we're building up nuclear and maybe some other sources, well, that would be, to me, be my plan. But there should absolutely not be borrowing huge amounts of money in these leveraged financing templates from China, I mean, that puts us over a barrel.
Mm.
BlackRock, vulture funds.
Mhm.
What the heck? We don't want to be borrowing. This is like the corporate equivalent or the institutional equivalent of doorstep lending. We
Yes, it's
get
shocking.
ourselves over a barrel and politically over a barrel to China.
So essentially, Bob, what you're saying is that the government should be cutting much more than it is. I mean, it's not cutting at all. It
No,
should be
it's not cutting
cutting a
at
lot of
all.
fat, and it should be only borrowing what it can genuinely afford to pay back, and cutting its spending. So cutting its borrowings, cutting its spending, essentially.
Yes, that's right. And if we do need to go to net zero, we need to use our own oil and gas reserves for the time that we need oil and gas instead of buying it from Norway. And I would go nuclear. It's the only real of the non-fossil fuel sources that creates enough energy and all the time. The wind power, it only creates energy when the wind's blowing. We can't rely on that. It's ludicrous.
It is, yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And not only when the wind's blowing, but only when the wind is not blowing too strongly.
And not too
Because
strongly either. So it'll
I
only
know,
work if climate change is unreal, because one of the
yes,
things of climate change is the wind's going to be much stronger. So it'll only work if what they're as a solution, if the problem that it's the solution to doesn't happen.
doesn't exist.
Lunacy, isn't it?
Excellent. Well, Bob, I'm going to put a link through to your report below this video. So if
Lovely.
anybody's interested in seeing the actual detail, the granular detail, and it's very detailed report, just have a look below, click on the link, and you can go and see it. Bob Lyddon, thank you very much indeed. Bob is a banking expert, a banking consultant, and he's telling us about his report into the shadow borrowing as well as the open borrowing that our government is doing for its investment products, investment projects, really. So this has been the Money Magpie Invest podcast. I have been Jasmine Birtles. As I said before, remember to subscribe, follow, comment. I always have a look at your comments. I'm always very interested in those. Like and tell all your friends. You know you want to. And see you next week.